So thank you very much for coming. My name is Andy Atkins. I am the Chief Executive as a Rocha UK, as many of you will know, so I recognise some of the faces at least on the call. What we're doing tonight is really trying to unpack a theme that we know, and I'm sure many of you know, is really important, not just to human life, but to natural and wildlife as well. And that is food, the way we produce our food, and so on. As we do at a Rocha UK, we pick a theme for each magazine, and if you're a regular supporter, you will get the magazine, so you will know that this is the theme of the latest magazine. So what we're doing tonight, for the first time really, is holding a webinar on that theme for our regular supporters and anybody else who's interested, to just have a quick unpacking of that theme so that we are, I hope, inspired to do more and challenged in our thinking, and can also share the lessons we have learned to help each other go forward in our thinking. That's the plan for tonight. So I'm very, very pleased to have with us here tonight David Chandler, who many of you will know as a former trustee of a Rocha UK, but he also happens to be a very good writer on nature professionally, and is also the editor of our magazine. So some of you who get the magazine will recognize his name from that. So he's overseen the latest magazine on redeeming food. We've also got the Reverend John White from one of a Rocha's partners in action, Hazelnut Community Farm in Bristol. And he will be looking at this issue from the perspective of a Christian community that is trying to redeem food in practice. What does it look like? Where are they at? What are the challenges? That sort of thing. And then we've also got Hannah Eves, who is a policy officer here at a Rocha UK, also doubles as my executive assistant on occasion, but is increasingly focusing on policy work, and in a former work researched theology practice around food. So those are our three panelists, if you like. So I'll be asking Hannah to speak first, really taking the overview of the issue in 10 minutes, very difficult thing to do, just to give us some of the main issues, some of the main debates, and some possible solutions to those. Then we will go on to John, who will talk about, as I said, the practice of trying to redeem food in a real life community in Bristol. And then we will go on to put you all in breakout rooms just for 5 minutes with a question for you to kick around and debate before we bring you all back in for a panel discussion. And if you have questions that occur to you as we go along, please just put them in the chat. Because of the numbers, it's going to be very difficult just to say when it comes to question time, please will the person on the right who's raised their hand come in. So what we'd ask you to do is to put any questions you've got in the chat, and we will while you're in a breakout group be looking at those to try and bring out a representative selection which I can then put to the panel. Okay, hope that makes sense. So with that, thanks once again for coming. I will ask Hannah to lead us off, please, with this overview of the issues. Thanks, Hannah.
Thank you. Well, good evening. So the question I have to tackle in 10 minutes is, how do we redeem food? What is the problem, and what are some of the solutions? And how does it impact nature, and what can we do about it? Well, I'm going to try and answer that question by offering you a simple framework. And this is a saying that was made famous by the food writer Michael Pollan. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. It seems simple enough, doesn't it? And if you follow these principles, you can't go too far wrong. And yet, food and eating, particularly in the context of our modern, globalized food systems, is infinitely more complicated than that. In fact, with every bite, we are connected to a long and complex global supply chain, to people and communities far beyond our own, to a long cultural history of how and why we eat the foods that we do, and to a vast ecosystem of plants, animals, and habitats. Yet we are eating ourselves to extinction, destroying the systems on which we depend to eat: a stable climate, rich soils, clean rivers, and intact terrestrial and marine ecosystems. So we need to redeem food and our food systems urgently. So we need to eat food. We need to enjoy it. We need to eat food to live, but we need to consider what impact we're having on nature. We need to eat food, but not too much. We need to consider food waste and overconsumption. We need to eat food, not too much, and mostly plants. We do need to change our diets in response to the science on food and climate change. But before I get into the meat of the issue, I want to recognize this is hugely complicated. If I had 10 hours, I couldn't cover the whole thing, and I have 10 minutes. So what I'm going to offer you is a framework for discussion, a starting point that I'm hoping is going to prompt more thought and more questions as we go along. So first, the problem, eating food. We need to think about the impact that food is having on nature. The biggest threat to nature is currently land use and land use change. So I'm talking about deforestation, draining of wetlands, and our farming systems, i.e. intensive agriculture. The driver of that land use change is food production through land clearance to grow crops and rear livestock. For example, deforestation in the Amazon to convert land for beef production and animal feed. But this isn't an issue that's exclusive to livestock, Soy production is actually another area when there's a huge issue when it comes to deforestation, although it's important to note that 75% of soybeans worldwide are actually used to feed animals. There are, of course, many other impacts on nature associated with food production. I could talk about pollution, soil degradation, water use, to name but a few, but we're just going to focus on land clearance for time and maybe dig into that later as a primary driver. So this is the problem. How do we rethink how we use our land to grow food? It's worth saying at this point, and I want to be really clear, that there are farmers across the UK working really hard on biodiversity and nature restoration on their land. And as custodians of that land, these farmers have this crucial expertise on this issue. It's important that we, in a transition to a more sustainable model, we do engage with that reality and listen to what they have to say and what they know about. But one of the things we need to think about is a reprioritization of how we use land to open up opportunities for nature. A thriving natural world will be good for wildlife and good for climate control, as well as helping to reverse declines in critical wildlife. It's also a key part of the UK government's commitments on reversing and halting nature loss. They've committed to restore 30% of land by 2030. So they're going to have to figure out how. And given that in the UK, 70% of habitable land is used for agriculture, we do need to engage in how we do farming to think about maybe how we could return some of that land to nature. Furthermore, while livestock takes up most of the world's agricultural land, it only actually produces 18% of the world's calories and 37% of total protein. So using land for animal feed that could otherwise be used to feed humans is just inefficient when you think about it. What if we redistributed some of that land for nature? So that's the first thing, recognizing how we eat, how we farm, and engaging with nature and our neighbours, thinking about how all of that has an impact. The second part, not too much. Eat food, but not too much. We need to think about how much we buy and consume. The world loses or wastes a third of all food between farm and table, according to the World Food Programme. This is partly about transportation and refrigeration infrastructure, the food that's lost between the producer and the market. But it's also about how quick we are, particularly in high-income countries, to throw away the food we don't need or want. And considering the high environmental impact of food that I've just gone over, and the millions worldwide that are undernourished, wasting food is more than a shame. It's actually a moral issue. Furthermore, interestingly, it's estimated that the average UK household loses hundreds of pounds per year in food waste. And in a context where everything's getting more expensive, actually tackling food waste is not only better for the planet, but it's better for your budget. So there are a few simple things you can do as an individual to reduce your food waste. Buying less to start with, meal planning, utilising leftovers. And a way individuals can contribute to measures to reduce food waste in the supply chain is by supporting efforts to relax cosmetic standards, such as an ugly veg scheme. So we need to eat food, but not too much. We need to be mindful of what we consume. So we need to eat food, not too much, mostly plants. The final thing I want to look at is how food production is actually a major contributor to climate change, responsible to 23% of global greenhouse gas emissions. In the same way that land use change drives biodiversity loss, it also drives climate change by converting habitats which absorb carbon, such as forests and grasslands, into farmland. A significant way in which we can tackle the climate crisis is by investing in habitat restoration, creating carbon sinks within the natural landscape. I'm thinking again about how we allocate land. There's also the impact of farm machinery and transport and ruminant livestock, particularly cattle, which emit methane, a powerful greenhouse gas. So when you take all of this together and you look at the opportunities, it's not hard to see how agriculture accounts for almost a quarter of the global emissions, but also how we could rethink what we do. So how can we reduce our carbon footprint as individuals, but also encourage systemic change on food production, food production's overall carbon footprint? Well, eat plants. On average, emissions from plant-based foods are 10 to 50 times smaller than those from animal products, according to a study in Science. Just by going vegetarian or committing to flexitarianism, looking at eating plants about 75% of the time, this can make a massive difference in your carbon footprint. Groundbreaking work by the Eat Lancet Commission has set out what a healthy diet for both people and planet might look like. It emphasizes a plant-forward approach where whole grains, fruits, vegetables, nuts and legumes are the main proportion of food that is eaten. While meat and dairy constitute an important part of the diet, they're significantly smaller portions. This is a really helpful framework, I think, because it's not an exclusive framework. It allows for meat and dairy. It's not an absolute approach, but it recognizes that a thoughtful plant-based eating can create co-benefits for human health as well as the health of the planet. So in conclusion, it's clear that urgent action is needed on food for climate and nature. We need to transform our food systems. And more than that, it's important to recognize as Christians that how we move in the world impacts people and planet, people that are beloved by God and nature that was created by his hands. In a country like the UK, we have access to convenient food, but often with little knowledge of where that food comes from, what it took to grow that food, or the web of cultural and ecological relationships involved. Much of what has gone wrong in our food system is about an inability to see beyond our own plates, but a response that is centered on care for creation, care for our neighbours, and love of God considers the impact of what we eat. So when it comes to food, I would advise you to eat food. Enjoy your food, eat it in company, share it, take pleasure in preparing it, but think about how you eat. What impact does that have on nature and the climate? Eat food, but not too much. Be mindful of how you consume food and what you waste. Consider food injustice. Where could you engage on that issue? And eat food, not too much, mostly plants. Consider moving towards a plant-forward, flexible approach to eating, which addresses the carbon footprint of what you eat and furthers your own health. I would say consider a flexitarian approach, cutting down meat and dairy and incorporating more plants, eating where you can locally and seasonally, and maybe just go meatless one day a week and see how you get on. And that's all I've got to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wonderful framing of a massive issue in just 9 minutes, I think. So well done, very impressive. We'll pass straight over to John, but just a reminder, if you have questions while you think of it, do bang them down in the chat room. But I'll hand over to John now from Hazelnut Community Farm to explain what they're trying to do about this in practice. John, over to you.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me as well today. Yep, so I'm John. I'm a vicar in the Church of England, and I run Hazelnut Community Farm. There's more on our website, hazelnutcommunityfarm.com, but as a start, what we do is we are a church that's located within a community garden, and we grow vegetables and fruit as an act of worship and as an act of connecting creator and creation together with community as well. And that's kind of formed my framework today. We're also a network that creates resources and helps churches and organizations take the first steps towards climate emergency. So I suppose if I'm going to sum up my whole point, it's going to be this, then that's that planting vegetables is the single greatest prophetic act in a time of climate emergency. That's a big statement, right? So I'm going to try and take the next 10 minutes and convince you that planting vegetables is the single greatest act in a time of climate emergency. So to start by doing that, I want to talk first of all about creator. And so we start with God, the creator. Now we look at the framework for which God has created this world, and that there is an interdependence between the earth and humanity. Norman Wordsworth, in his book, This Sacred Life, called it a meshwork of life, that we are completely interdependent. We are not separate from, but we rely on each other just in the same way that we rely on God, with different emphasis, of course. So we are dependent on nature. And for thousands of years, for loads of time, it's been normal for humanity to grow their own food. It's been a part of the world in which that was created. It was a part of the seasonality of life, and we would just grow own food. Also, we see even in Psalms, it says the heavens declare the glory of God. I think this is really interesting because I think when we read this with modern eyes, we're talking about beauty, right? The heavens declare the glory of God. When we go to Cornwall and we see beautiful clouds, we say, isn't God amazing? But I think that's actually evidence of our disconnect from this world. And I'll make more about that in our next point. In that, I think the heavens declare the glory of God in the consistency of seasons, in the way light changes, in rain, in earth, in the whole meshwork, the whole ecosystem that is around declares the glory of God, not just in beauty. It's also in producing and how we produce food for us as well. So creator is very much the key first part. The second part, and it'll make more sense as I go. I'm trying to make kind of a framework as well, just like Hannah did. The second part is creation. So I was recently reading, that's me, that's onions. I mean, come on, that's amazing. I was reading recently Wendell Berry, and Wendell Berry makes this case that we have amnesia, planet amnesia. And he says that when it comes to food, is that we no longer and this was written in the 80s, but modern humanity no longer sees themselves as part of the agricultural cycle. So in a sense, we see agriculture as something separate from us that we have no part in, and our eating has nothing to do with what's being grown. It's completely gone from our minds. So it's almost as if it's some magical thing that food kind of comes about already prepared, in shops, and we just buy it and it's always there. And we have no connection to its origin, its place, how it was grown, what it is at all. And it's this amnesia that we've taken ourselves out of creation. We've taken ourselves completely away from creation as well. And so what we found is that basically, as we've grown as a community and literally grown, not just in numbers, but as growing vegetables, is that this is the best act of rediscovery. So in a sense, waking up from this amnesia. So even if you take rewilding or planting fruit trees, which is all very good, I'm not criticizing that, but there's something specific about vegetables that you have to pay attention to them, right? If you're planting a tomato and you plant it once and you never go back to it, what happens to that tomato? Well, it doesn't flourish, right? I mean, sometimes it might accidentally do that, but generally it just doesn't flourish. Once you plant something, you are attuned to weather patterns. You're thinking about water. You're thinking about seed. And what we found is that through growing vegetables, that's a starting place for a whole range of conversations. Do you know, I really knew that this spring was really damp, and we've had a super hot summer so far. Generally, if I wasn't growing vegetables, I would just be a bit uncomfortable. But the fact that I'm looking and learning about my plants, I'm connected to the rhythms of nature, and I see when it's not matching up. So essentially, growing vegetables is having that reawakening happen. So that's what I want to do. I want to encourage people that's what part of the reason why I say this is the greatest thing for us to do is because it's the easiest way for a modern world to re-engage with creation, to get your hands in the soil, to begin those conversations. And then from there, when you grow vegetables, you have conversations about meat. You have conversations about how much you eat, just the things Hannah's talking about. You also have the conversations about seeds, where they come from, how do you save them? Do people put copyrights on seeds? Is that right or is that wrong? It's a justice conversation. There's lots to say about that. You think about water. How do we use water? How do we waste water? Huge conversation. We think about weather patterns. We think about how far food travels. You can see all these conversations that happen as you actually get your hands in your soil and you begin to grow. So I would say that a part of creation is this rediscovery and waking up from this amnesia. And I think growing vegetables is the key. The second point I want to make is about community. Now, and I just a little caveat here as well, is I still think no matter how urban, so we're in a really urban space, no matter how urban your space, you can still grow something in a pot. Even if you have a church and it's full of graves, you can still grow some things in a pot. So I'm not talking about taking over huge tracts of farmland. maybe in more rural areas, you have more space. I really believe you can also do this in really urban spaces as well. So I really encourage this. So community. So what we found in our community is that we have over half of our community resettled from Hong Kong. And what we do is we work together as an act of worship, and we grow vegetables, and we also pray and take communion and different things as well. But what we found is that people who would be uncomfortable in church or not knowing the liturgy and things are very comfortable coming into community garden, coming into our space. What we've also found is that there is a common language in creation. So we might grow different things. We might grow bananas in one country and tomatoes in another, but the process by which growing happens is the same, right? Seed, ground, water, weather, you watch it, right? And so in a sense, God has created this world with one common language, and that is creation. It is growing together. And so when people come into our garden, they feel comfortable because they know and they're comfortable with the act of growing or learning to grow. And that's been a really great thing. So in a sense, it's a common grace that everyone can enter into and be invited into. And that, in a sense, also creates biodiversity within our community and within the land. So our community works better when we work together and we're diverse, and creation helps with that. The other thing is part of this amnesia, I would say, is this disconnect that we think we can consume, much kind of like what Hannah was saying as well. We can just consume and consume and consume. It doesn't really matter. I think what helps is when you grow things is that it puts humility into you. So every gardener that I've met who's a real good gardener, an expert gardener, they always seem a bit humble. I reckon if I met Monty Don right now and he was on this, I said, Monty Don, are you an expert gardener? Monty Don probably go, well, I'm pretty all right. I like to grow things, And I think the reason why there's this humility is because there's an awareness that no matter, even if you do everything right, not everything is going to come around. Not every seed is going to come up. Not everything's going to grow perfectly. Even the act of growing is, in a sense, an act of going beyond yourself. When you put a seed in the ground, you can't do anything else. You can water a bit, but it's beyond you. The whole act of this is, in a sense, moving beyond ourselves. And I think that is what opens us up to Creator as well. And it also opens up to this amnesia, is that we can't consume without end when we know the cost that it is. Do you know, I grew pumpkins last year. I don't know if anyone here has grown pumpkins, but I took so much love and care for the pumpkin that I grew. And I only grew a couple last year. So I grew some big ones. They were exciting. And then I go up to like a supermarket and I see a huge amount of pumpkins for like £1. And I think, how are they doing it? The time and care that it takes to grow a pumpkin. And now they're doing it for £1 so people can carve them up and throw them away. There's just such a disconnect. By growing it, I find a love for it, and you see the value of it, and that changes the way that you look at food as well. So there's humility into it as well as a community. So kind of my last point here is empowerment then. And I want to say that one of the things that we've sought to do in creating a beautiful garden that is productive with also pollinator plants is to create a place where people can feel that they can come home, they can breathe, they can have peace, creating a whole place of peace. I believe this is the future of the church in an age of climate emergency and communities, to create places of peace, to create places of growing and co-growing together where people can come in. Imagine if you take just the Church of England, which I know people are from different ones, and you add in the Baptist and Methodist and United Reformed and everything. Imagine if we were known as people of the land who grew things, and we grew things and we empowered people to grow, and we shared that out and we shared that wisdom out and we invited people in. Imagine the power of every parish, every corner, all that church land, all those vicarage gardens, all those, imagine we power our people to grow in their own areas. Imagine the overturn. Imagine what that would do to all these communities that we grew together and we gave away the veg that we grew, or we empowered people to grow. I think there's a real power for that. And I think there's a place of peace that we can create as well. The other thing I just want to say is it's about interdependency and not codependency. Empowerment is important for us at Hazelnut, is that we don't want to just grow food and then have people come and eat our food. We want to teach people how to grow so they can go do it in their own areas. I think too long the church is really been about codependency. Come to us and we'll give you what you need. I think the thing about growing food is that it is amazing way for people to be empowered and for us to collaborate and work together and invite others to come home in their own way as well. So that's about Hazelnut creator creation community empowerment. I hope I've just begun to convince you that growing vegetables is the thing to do as at least a starting point in a climate emergency.
Thank you very, very much. And there's so much in there. I love your creation is growing together. I don't know if you've copyrighted that or whether that's actually from some deep recess of the Bible that I haven't noticed, but I love that phrase. Excellent one. Right, everybody. Thank you, John, for that philosophical and theological, but also practical guide to what are you actually doing and why. That's excellent. So we're going to suggest you go into working groups now. Not working groups, just brainstorming groups or whatever, just to have 5 minutes together. And the question, I mean, you can talk about whatever you want, but really the idea is to think about and just share briefly with each other in your small groups. What does redeeming food look like for your home, for your family, for your community? Perhaps think about, what are you already doing? What have you been thinking you should do more of? What are you trying out? Because we're all on this call. We're all here because we care. There's probably not one person here who doesn't believe there's something a bit wrong with the way we're doing food. So just share what you've been doing so far, but perhaps where you're trying to get to so far. Maybe things you really don't know and understand, that's okay. But just share what you have been thinking, what you are trying to do. What does it look like for you so far? And we'll bring you back in 5 minutes, and then we'll have the panel with the speakers, and I'll put some questions to them. So if I may, I will start to pick out some questions. There's some interesting statements as well in the chat, and thanks for those of you who are sharing what you have been doing. That's really encouraging to know. We've got a first question directed at Hannah, which is, could you comment on the scientific evidence that ruminants are actually beneficial as protectors of the soil in various ways, digesting plant biomass, excreting waste as manure, suitable for germination of seeds, etc. So surely without that process, land becomes barren. What do you say to that?
Oh no, it's such a good question, Catherine, and I really thank you for it, because it's something that I love to learn a bit more about. I mean, I start off by saying I'm in no way an expert on soil or ruminants, so that in some ways no, but I would actually say that it's important to recognize I'm not advocating for a scenario in which we have no meat, no ruminants, it's all plants. I'm thinking about how do we reduce our meat, and I think there is a place for that, and keeping some ruminants around. And I think it's also something we need to think about is we didn't eat meat at this level for years and years. This is still quite a modern thing to expect meat most nights, actually. So I think there's a question there about how do we reduce our meat whilst also kind of recognizing where there can be benefits from those type of animals, but also thinking we've got to balance that with the methane, with all of the things that we know about the climate science and ruminants. So I think, it's a really interesting question, but I do think there is a little bit of a dynamic there. Less meat, not no meat, possibly is a good way forward.
So thanks, Hannah. And David, do you want to come on the back of that?
Yeah, am I being heard? I think I am.
Yeah, we can hear you. Yep.
So yeah, just thinking, I mean, biblically, people ate meat. I mean, Hannah's talked about the fact that, it's the frequency, the amount, and I think it's the way that meat is produced that are the issues. And I'm thinking of the big rewilding initiatives that are going on. They largely depend on big herbivores as part of that system. So, NEP, for example, has cattle, has deer, has pigs. So I think it's about quantities and stocking levels and the way we treat meat, and not seeing it as an everyday necessity, but in the Bible they killed the fatted whatever for special occasions. It was a rare thing, it wasn't an everyday. I think we need to be nearer that. We need to see it as special, not expect it to cost a small amount of money. Be prepared to pay for good quality meat if we're going to eat meat.
May I add something to that? Is that all right? When we did our research project a few years ago, we developed this idea of meat for celebration based on that biblical principle that David talked about. And we said, go buy some good quality meat, look at how it's sustainably sourced and all of those sorts of things, and then invite people around, share a meal, because that's also a biblical principle. It's kind of table fellowship that Jesus showed us and exemplified, and that kind of bringing together of a community. So I would just add that as kind of like a little bit of biblical as well.
Without meaning to in any way undermine what you, Hannah, and David have just said, which I totally agree with. It's about the quantity and the quality. One of the if you like, the natural miracles that I most love is you put a few big herbivores back on the land from which they have disappeared, and you discover all sorts of plants and bird life springs up, because they are meant to be there, but it's the quantity of them. And so if anybody's been to an RSPB reserve in the last 20 years, you will have noticed that Highland cattle have suddenly reappeared in places where you didn't expect to see them. That's because they're bringing them deliberately to the reserve to pockmark the soil so that little plants can take root there that otherwise wouldn't do in hard packed soil. So there is absolutely a place, as you said in your question, but it's all about where are they meant to be, where are they not meant to be, and the quantity of them. Anyway, thanks for that. Really good, bringing together the biology and the conservation with the food and the health. I'm going to go to John now. John, we've had a really important question, I think, that is, I think many of us would think about, and it's this: that we try to buy locally, but the food is considerably more expensive than cheaper supermarket products. What is the way forward for families on a tight budget? I suppose it's a question about how can you be nature friendly when you're skint, kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's a huge question. I think first of all, I think it's important for us to say that is also climate emergency. The fact that food prices are going up is not just some random occurrence. This is us feeling what is happening, and we're going to feel this more. So that is a problem. So even more motivation for us to care about this. So that is a shame. I think part of what I would encourage is for you to think about your community or your church and grow collectively. So and so maybe this is start with the big pictures. Imagine if you had a whole neighborhood or whole church beginning to want to grow. And imagine you had someone named Shirley who was a great grower of tomatoes, and Patricia grew great cucumbers, and someone else grew wheat, and you could make flour out of it. And then you began to trade and barter amongst yourselves. Yeah. So if more people grow the way that, I'll tell you what, if anyone's ever grown courgettes, neighbors will just be like, please stop giving me courgettes. Do you know what I mean? Like, they're just prolific. So I think there's a thing where if we collectively start growing, we can then share seeds and wisdom and things like that. Example of what we're doing in Hazelnut now is we're starting a seed bank. And so we're going to create, because we're in a quite urban area with lots of diversity. So we're going to create a mix of heirloom seeds, and we're also going to do seeds for local communities and what they would grow in their culture. And then we're going to have a harvest meal together. So those seeds will be free, and then you can save them. So you're learning and you're giving back. I think the other thing is, it's not I understand it's difficult. It's a difficult time. I wish I had huge answers for you. I would say start small. Lettuce is generally not that expensive. It's maybe not nutritious, but you can add that and then add stuff to that as well. So find meals that you're like, I'm comfortable cooking these, and they're delicious sides. That's something that we've done, is just even getting a little bit more veg in everything that we cook as a starting place. I wish I could say it was some easier way, but start with raw veg first instead of having to buy pre-prepared things, or things that are quite complex. Just buy straight veg and learn to cook with them. That's really important as well.
Thanks, John. I want a question of David. So, David, you're a traveling nature writer. I mean, over the years that you've been doing this, have you seen any change yourself in places where you've been, in, let's say, the clash between nature and food production? I mean, just literally as you've gone around the world, do you see evidence of this yourself, or like nothing looks any different?
I don't often get to go back to places twice, so seeing change is quite tricky. But it did make me think, and this raises all sorts of other questions, of course, of traveling to Australia once, flying over, I think it may have been Malaysia, Singapore, somewhere in Indonesia, and you can see below areas where tropical forest has been cleared to grow whatever, I don't know, soya or whatever. And that's, if you just ponder that, that's really heartbreaking, actually. So those sorts of things. I mean, closer to home, not to do with traveling at all, really, just traveling into the back garden, we laid some wildflower turf earlier this year, which is turf where the plants are already, it's recycled textiles and the plants are already in it. So it's not like just tossing seed out, which is really difficult to get to work. They're already germinated, and it's worked brilliantly, 27 species. And there are insects around there, but there aren't that many. It's full of pollinators, full of plants that are good for pollinators. And yes, there are bees, and we've had hummingbird hawk moth in the garden, but it's not a mass of insects that I want it to be. And I know this year, there's talk of it being a poor insect year. So there's that sort of change as well.
Well, so then this is a question really to John now. Is there anything that has particularly surprised you since you embarked on growing together with others? And I suppose if I can throw in an addition to that, so what have been some of the challenges, some of the things you perhaps didn't expect? So since you've been doing it, what surprised you? Some challenges.
I think one of the things that surprised me is we're in a really urban area, and just how contested land is. Even if you have a really good project, the power that developers have is outrageous. We've got folks from Hong Kong who are coming to us who have never grown before because everywhere's developed. And in Bristol, I feel the same thing's happening. They're just putting houses up everywhere with no infrastructure. And that's really scary. So to grow even vegetables, even as a community garden, it is not seen by cities as important compared to housing. And that's really difficult. So in a sense, they're happy to take green space away. I have found that growing together, I found that the deepest conversations happen around garden beds in a way that don't even happen in the back of a church. People just talk to one another. One of the things that's also interesting is because I would lead the thing, I'll step back and I'll look around and I just see people included. I don't see people on the edge. I don't see people cast aside. I feel like in a garden, you can kind of choose where you need to go and fit in. And so it's a bit of a choose your own adventure. We've got people on the learning spectrum come along and feel that they can be at home and be themselves in a way they couldn't in other places that are more regimented and regulated. I think also just a really small thing, but it's a big thing for me, is the creativity of it. Like we're growing some jeweled corn right now. It's this beautiful colored corn, and the corn has got this purple stalk. And the person I work with always jokes with me about it. I just love it. I feel like I helped create that. I did something to do that. It feels like a piece of art that I created that I get to look after and care for. And it brings me such joy. So I think there's real joy in our community as well. I would say also is how fast it ingrains us within a community. So in our community garden, we've had people come in now. We've only been there since March in our new location. We've had hundreds of people come through and be like, I'm watching what you're doing. It's so stunning what you're doing. Thank you for what you're doing. I can see it. We had one lady named Chloe who came there today and goes, it feels like you're spreading love all around and we can encounter it. Thank you for caring for our community in this way. Like, what a visible sign of the grace of the Lord in our lives. So, yeah.
So there's a comment here, John for president. Now I'm going to hijack that comment mercilessly and say, has anybody got any comment to say about the role of politics in this? Because it seems to me, absolutely, the church should be doing what it can, and we as individual Christians, individual human beings, maybe wanting to do what we can. But it's a bit missing for this discussion for me so far. It's like, what's the role of the government? Can anybody want to throw in something on that? And then I just so that Hannah's aware of it, I really want to ask about, is there a generational thing going on here as well? So I have kids who are late 20s, early 30s, and I know a real difference in their eating preferences to my generation, it seems to me. So, but I'd be interested to talk to the one person on the screen I can see who's probably under 30, to go, well, what do you think about that one? But just any comments on, you know, John or David, what should government be doing about this?
David, you go. You take this one. I'll follow up whatever you did say.
Thanks, John. I think the obvious thing is around, you know, historically, farming has largely been driven by what the government wants it to do. You know, it's where the subsidies go. I'm no expert on these things, and you know, I think, you know, reform is ongoing, and Andy, you can probably fill in more of the details than I can on this. But yeah, I mean, you know, what the farming world is encouraged to do by government policy can have a huge impact on, you know, on what is grown, on how land is managed, on import and export, all those sorts of things.
So that's really interesting, because I read recently that you know, some of you will be aware that Zach Goldsmith, Conservative Lord, resigned this week with a tirade against his own government about their policies on the environment. And one of the many things he complained about was the fact that new trade deals that are being struck since Brexit are undermining our own environmental standards, that basically we're accepting trade deals with other countries which allow them to produce food at a lesser environmental standard than us. It's like become a race to the bottom, which of course we were promised would not happen. So there's also the question you mentioned of course, farm policies, and there was the common agricultural policy before Brexit, which was pretty damaging in some ways, and that, you know, there was big hope of reform. Michael Gove proposed a very interesting system, actually, of rewarding farmers much more for their care for the environment, which I think for many of our partners would have been a thrill, because they were wanting to do that anyway, but don't get a lot of support. But a lot of that has been weakened since, with successive changes in the government. So if we've got farmers out there in the audience, I think it'd be interesting to hear from you. But I understand it's very uncertain, and farmers do, like anybody else, need a degree of certainty about what the policies are, so that they can invest and so on. But we know from among our partner base, there are many farmers wanting to care for God's creation as they do it, but they do need some consistency of policy and the right support, I think, on occasion. So we are almost out of time, but I want to give a couple of there was a question there to Hannah, just about the generational thing. Is it my imagination, or is there a generational shift in how people are approaching food?
I mean, it's a really good question. I mean, I think there's sort of two things to it. And I mean, the first thing is, I think there's a lot of information out there. I mean, you can sort of, maybe one of you guys could speak to that actually, but it feels like people are paying attention to this issue more than they ever have. So I feel like my generation is like kind of, we can't really escape from the reality of climate change. Like, you know, it's almost to a point where it's detrimental to people's mental health, like the kind of information that we're receiving. We kind of know what's going on, I imagine, in a way that other generations maybe just didn't kind of encounter at the same time. And at the same time, we have a lot of access to a lot of information in our pocket, in our smartphones. Again, a detriment to mental health, but, you know, we're sort of connected to the information and global world in a way that I don't think generations before were. But I think there's also this kind of activist culture that's really kind of coming through. I mean, I know a lot of young Christians who are climate activists, and this kind of generation who's sort of looking around, seeing what's happening and saying, we're not having it. And, you know, possibly not as invested as generations above us, because we can't afford housing. We can't afford, you know, we're crippled by student debt. You know, this generation, I think, is feeling like we got to kick back because we're seeing so much injustice. And we are, you know, we've not got a whole lot to lose at this point, you know, in some ways. I think there's something about that as well. So, I mean, I don't know, but I think you're right. I think there is a generation that are really kind of picking up their placards and walking out.
Thanks, Hannah. I'm extending this question time very briefly. There's a couple of more interesting comments which I just want to read out because I think they're very important. From Ethel, retailers also have a big influence on farming. Absolutely right. And I think we've got to think also about the prices that farmers get when retailers are constantly squeezing them as well so that they can sell us cheap food and compete with each other to be the cheapest. So retailers surely have a lot to answer for. And then from Nick Lear, who I happen to know, farms, hope that's fair to say, farmers are getting the regenerative message. Times are changing. I mean, that's great to know. I think we are in a Rocha very sympathetic towards many farmers because we know what they're trying to do, but how difficult it is. Nick, if there were time, I'd love to hear more from you. I'm sure others would about that, but it's good to hear. One last question on a very practical note. John, to you. How does the veg patch look in winter? Mine always looks a bit barren. Any tips to keeping it looking loving? Nice.
Actually, that is a really good question, and that affects our liturgy really strongly. So we are really busy in the spring, and we're really busy in the summer, and winter it slows down. And what we're aware of is, as for instance, you take Christmas, and for some reason, the church is now taking upon themselves to make bespoke carol services for everybody, right? So a vicar or church is exhausted because they've done 50 carol services on the run up to Christmas. So like old people carols, young people carols, carols for redheads, carols for people named Carol. It's crazy, right? And what we did is we looked at our beds and we're like, we're busy all the time. We can't keep consuming or putting out. And so we do something called Slow Christmas, where we literally slow down and we meet less, and we encourage people to meet in homes or go to other churches and stuff as well. And so the slowness of the beds, we try and reflect that and how we are, and actually have our church be seasonal. We're aware that we're busier in spring and summer. I think also a couple of really practical things is leeks are great because they can last through the winter, and they're great eating year round. We also, there's more about kind of soil and stuff, but you can always put up some green manure like clover and those things that can grow, cover the ground, and it means that they're can be chopped down and added back. They're also nitrogen fixers, so great for soil. The other thing is, if you do no dig, you can put cardboard over your beds. It's not pretty, but it covers your soil again, so your soil is not just out all that way. But what I encourage you is, see how the season will affect your actual liturgy and slow down and encourage different paths as well. I think that's the other thing I'd say. Sorry, one last thing, Andy, is harvest. So we're huge into harvest. But harvest is not one day in October where you bring canned sweet corn. That doesn't make any sense. Why are we doing that? Like, that's good. Bringing canned food to church is good, but it's not harvest. What we do is we start harvest in the spring with the seed blessing, and we plant and we grow, and then harvest becomes a whole season, months in our church where we eat together and celebrate what we've grown. And so it becomes this whole rich season of celebration. But it's risky. It's risky caring about land, because what I find is I have more winter blues than I did before I started getting into gardening. And so it's a really real thing. I really feel the loss of nature in those times. So, yeah.
Wow. John, thank you. Thank you for that question. Fascinating one, and a real life, situation that I think probably, you mentioned winter blues there. I mean, some of us probably suffer from SAD around this table, and getting out in the fresh air is one thing that keeps me sane in the winter, even if it is all grey and wet. But if you're a gardener and you see your garden go into bleakness, I can imagine it's worse, not better. So anyway, guys, there is so much more we could talk about. I'm going to ask David in a minute to close with a prayer, but I first want to just do a little bit about next steps for those who want to take next steps, if that's okay. Many of you here I recognize. I know you're already a Rocha supporters, and you already get the magazine. But if you're not, and you would be interested to get this magazine, with we have a 6-monthly magazine that takes an issue like this. If you're interested to get this one or back copies, you can go on our website, and if you go to the top web address there, if you cut and paste from this slide or take a photo of it, that will take you straight to our magazine page, where you can look at the past editions and the issues they cover, You can buy individual ones, past copies at just £3.50. But also, really importantly to us, if you want to become a regular donor to a Rocha UK, small Christian charity aiming to mobilize Christians and churches to care for God's creation, if you can set your own monthly limit there, you can do what you want. But if you give £25 or more a year, you will automatically then get this magazine. So if anything we've said tonight encourages you to want to be more a part of a Rocha and to be a regular supporter, please go to that website. You can do it all online, set your own limits, but you will then get the magazine regularly. That may not be for you, or you may already be doing that. So I point you towards the next thing, which is our raft of bulletins, free e-bulletins. And the one I point you towards particularly is Wild Christian. It's every 2 months. It gives you a range of things you can do to enjoy, nurture, and defend nature, from biblical reflections to practical actions to campaigning actions around nature, and increasingly nature and climate, nature and food, nature and pollution, nature and you can get that free, and you can sign up there if you go to that website, so we can keep you informed of things that you can do. Okay, so it's been a pleasure to have you here tonight. I wish we could have longer, but we've tried longer seminars, and I think 1 hour on a weekday evening is quite enough for most people. Thank you for coming, and I will just ask now David to close for us in prayer.
Sure. Father, thank you for the technology that makes this possible. Lord, thank you that, gathered here are a group of people who care about creation. And Lord, we're just a tiny subset of many more people who care as well. Lord, thank you for good food. Help us to enjoy our food, Lord, to eat it thoughtfully, Lord, to be thankful for it. And Father, I pray for all of those that grow our food, that you will bless them, Lord, that you will help them to, be able to be supported by policies or whatever to grow that food well, in a way that produces good food and is good for the rest of creation as well. And Lord, I pray for the decision makers, that you'll open their eyes to what needs to be done. Lord, that you will give them the will to do something, Father. And Father, I pray for the church, that the church will shine as an example of what can be done to move these things in the right direction. In your name, Jesus. Amen.